as engineers, we are taught that we are problem solvers. It is an inspiring statement, but that's where the problem begins. So when a hard problem interacts with a soft problem, interacting with a messy problem, you get a wicked problem.
It's said that a problem well defined is half solved, but that what you call wicked problems, they are very hard to even define.
People are relaxing on the streets and then boom, the thing explodes. It opens up this flood going at 35 miles per hour. And school kids coming that afternoon are all like, wrapped like candies.
Till late 20s, early 30s, the only way to learn how to fly a plane is to get into a plane, even if you've never flown before.
He reaches a point where he's ready to sell his company to anyone who would pay him $500 total. Even these big companies, most notably from Silicon Valley, invest 60-70% in maintenance.
Without understanding their full context and history, you can't even begin to take shot at trying to solve the problem.
Every house in Mohenjo-daro had a washroom and a water-based latrine. In modern India, we don't have that facility. So I sat at the very stone bench where Tulsidas wrote and composed Ramcharitmanas. You have 100 cars, it's a parking lot. You have 1,000 cars, it's the traffic. You got 1,000,000 cars, it's a mega city. You got 1,000,000,000 cars, you got climate change.
Guru, welcome to SparX. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you. I read your book, Wicked Problems, How to Engineer a Better World, last year. And I think you may remember, I read the book. I was so inspired by both the topic that you were covering as well as the treatment you have done. I looked you up on internet, found your email address, sent you an email, and it's great to see that you made it not only to SparX but also to Jaipur Lit Fest, and it's great to catch you here for this conversation. So once again, welcome.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad the book sparked an interest in you, and I'm glad that we are connected. The conversations that we have had since then have also been inspiring for me. So I remain as much a student as anyone, and it's a joy.
Yeah, this is your first time at Jaipur Lit Fest?
Yes, first time to Jaipur also. And again, the whole city has such a character that is a fruitful mixture and a reminder of power, community, religion, commitment to arts, literature. It is such a fusion, you cannot usefully separate a single strand of them. I cannot even think of any other way in which Jaipur could exist. I mean, some of our friends from abroad, even though I was born in India, and coming to Jaipur is a very different experience. As you know, going to any part of India is such a different experience. For anyone living in India, it's amazing. A colleague of ours said, borrowing the title of that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
Yeah.
So a sensory overload is something that has come up. But of course, the literature festival, as it's being dubbed the Mahakumbh, while it's happening in conjunction with the Kumbh Mela, is also appropriate and fitting.
Yeah. For me, this is now 4th time in a row, and I've really grown to love the festival, people involved, how it is organized, and how well attended it is, both authors from India and from outside like yourself, but also a lot of just aspiring authors, people who love literature, who love books. I've been a book lover. We did one whole podcast before, called Power of Books. So for somebody like myself to be here and just be surrounded by the books is outstanding.
What is even more inspiring was the amount of students that were present. Of course, I was born and brought up in India, and I went to the United States for higher education and whatnot. But the amount of engagement that they had and the conversations that I've had with them made me think, what was I doing at their age? And that also shows the steep growth in, shall we say, literary sensibility these in the younger generation. But that also, of course, immediately reminded me saying that, what am I talking about as a steep growth? India has always been a culture of high literary sensibility. Yeah. It's about how we exercise, shape, and apply for our own cultural benefit, which is, I think, what's going on in my own worldview as kind of playing with these engineering concepts for cultural benefit. And if you want to be upfront about it, engineering is our original cultural choice. The most potent cultural choice, far more ancient. I mean, as an act of know-how, it predates the sciences and the philosophy of know what. So, given that context, how are we to then responsibly shape and cultivate the kind of the cultural elements that we need to survive, to make a better world?
Yeah, no, that's outstanding. Being able to reflect on our heritage in engineering, especially sitting in Jaipur, I guess it's also apt context because Jaipur also has a lot of history and a lot of architectural marvels that that continues to inspire people. But coming to your book, Guru, and as an engineer, I trained as an engineer, worked as software engineer for a long period of time, and also have thought about these large complex problems. So I was honestly hooked when the moment I saw the title Wicked Problems, because in some ways, even without knowing what you're going to write in the book about, it some visceral sense, made sense to me that perhaps, this book is going to be about these large, messy problems. Just to give an example of climate, it's such a difficult problem. Where is the head and tail of this problem? Whose problem it is? No one knows. Would love to hear, your thought process. What led you up to writing this book and thinking of titling this Wicked Problems?
I can take the convenient step of describing how my earlier book shaped the current one. My first book, I titled it Applied Minds, How Engineers Think. And it was an exercise to articulate to myself and to the rest of, let's say, the readers, what does it actually mean to think like an engineer, and what are the consequences attached to it? So I tried to distill it down, fairly reductionist exercise. Okay, what are the 3 or 5 different things that engineers constantly engage themselves in? And I tried to boil it down to bringing structure to a situation where there's none, the ability to work under constraints, which is the hallmark of engineering design. Of course, artists also have a lot of constraints, but engineering constraints are altogether different, in a different league, I would say. And the ability to make judicious trade-offs. In life, you cannot have everything. This is a powerful lesson that we're all, as human beings, know. But how do you do that in a system where you have an active role and agency? And so, structure constraints trade-off became a useful construct for me to tell a range of stories. But then, how do you get to the levels of complexity that we are struggling with? There are developments in society, in life, that are giving us conveniences, even confidence. In some cases, fake, illegitimate confidence that says that, yeah, because we were able to do this, we can also do that kind of thing. So that's an delusion that I struggle with, having constructed a career in Washington as an engineer. And I tried to engage with. In my earlier professional career, when I was an engineer, I used to deal with a lot of problems where there were well-defined goals given to us by customers, clients, consumers. All I had to do was reliably and responsibly meet them under the time constraints and under budget. And we did that. Everyone does that. And yet then there are the broader reflections of what does it mean to be an engineer, especially when all these dynamics around us seem to shape the profession that is service-oriented in a way. So that's why I decided to take on, okay, what does it mean to think of unsolvable problems? It almost started as a detective story, where I, as an engineer, I'm going in search of solutions for problems that don't have solutions. And it quickly became something else. And it all starts with this basic idea that as engineers, we are taught to, and we deeply believe in, and we actively express that worldview, that we are problem solvers. It is an inspiring statement, but that's where the problem begins. And as I go through the layers of this politics, if we want to acknowledge that, behind how we think about and how we formulate problems, there are classes of problems, call them hard problems, that have bounds. And as I said, that they are neatly specified to engineers by someone else or by themselves.
And all engineers prefer those hard problems because they are neatly summarized, and it's said that, right, a problem well defined is half solved, but that what you call wicked problems, they are very hard to even define.
Exactly. And hard problems turn out also to be very profitable. So therefore, we get this confidence saying that, yeah, because we are good at solving hard problems, therefore, I think we can apply the same rubric or the confidence to deal with the bigger ones.
These bigger problems or wicked problems, what is their significance for the world that we live in? First of all, whose problems are they? Who engages in solving those problems? Do you choose to work on those problems, or they're kind of thrust upon you where you have no choice and you need to deal with that? Where does it come into purview? Like, where do let's say somebody like you and me, we get to engage in these wicked problems?
It was back in the 1960s, a pair of scholars in California, Horst Riddle, Melvin Weber, wrote a paper which coined wicked problems as a term which we now talk about. They identified 10 properties of problem sets that have this kind of boundarylessness. They lack, let alone precise definition, lack any definition. Each are unique. And we don't know where they start, where they end. We don't know when they enter, when they exit. We don't know if a problem is something on its own or if it's a symptom of something else. And the solutions that one gets to think about for wicked problems, as they called it, aren't true or false, but good or bad. And the only thing that can be done with wicked problems is trial and error. Now, as inspiring as it is for anyone, it was a fantastic diagnostic. And the quality and the longevity of the paper is still very valuable. It's applicable to pretty much any dimension of this. I'm glad that they wrote this paper because it's continuing to influence our thinking here. But now, what do engineers do with it? Is the question. And we were talking about hard problems that produce crisp solutions.
Let me take an example of two wicked problems in Indian context, and some of this both you might have heard even all the way back to Washington DC. One is this air quality problem in Delhi. It gets really bad in October, November. There is all this crop burning stuff, firecrackers, and some seasonal winds and so on. Delhi kind of sits on this dust bowl, and then air quality becomes one of the worst, if not the worst, in the world. It is a seat of the government, so everyone sees it. You come out of your room and you will see what's going on. You're breathing that air, and yet no one is able to do anything about it. There is a lot of conversation usually in October, November. By December, January, starts to fade in memory. By I think March, April, people will forget about it.
So it's
until,
almost a
cyclical thing. Same thing from the city that I come from, Bangalore. The infrastructure and traffic is just becoming a nightmare. It can easily take you between half an hour to an hour to commute for 4 or 5 kilometers. Everyone laments about it. I'm bringing up even this podcast where we are in Jaipur and has nothing to do with Bangalore. But these are two examples of this large, complex, messy problem with no owners. But maybe going back to the context of your book also, you can share some examples of what you consider are the wicked problems, and maybe people in the past who attempted to solve it and maybe done something about it.
Yeah. So before I give a couple of examples about wickedness, let's briefly examine the nature of wickedness. Yeah. How does wickedness even emerge to the point that it becomes right in your face kind of thing? Since you were talking about Bangalore and traffic, I mean, one of the examples that I talked about in the book is about managing trash in Bangalore, which was a huge problem, especially with the internationalization, all the companies flowing into Bangalore, and how do you manage trash? And the technological approach is one thing, do this. But if people don't understand exactly what's the difference between a dry waste and wet waste, the entire thing is futile. And same that goes with the pollution problem. A hallmark feature of a wicked problem is they're tainted by familiarity. Because you see them, then you quickly fade or progress away from it, and then it comes up again and so forth. So that's where there are some continuity aspects of it as well. So we talked about hard problem. Let's say manufacturing a car is a hard problem. But since we're in India, we are in Jaipur, we talked about traffic in Bangalore. Managing traffic is a soft problem, so to speak, which is actually a harder problem. A soft problem is complicated by behaviors and also the political dimensions here. I mean, it gets even more funky when you try to do congestion pricing and so forth. Now, Very recently in New York City, they introduced a congestion pricing zone, and now there are discussions in Washington whether it should be continued or not already within just a very brief period of introduction. So it comes down to this powerful concept of what are you willing to pay to achieve something? What are you willing to pay to have this air pollution go away? It comes down to an individual view of the world, but at the same time, you're also thinking about the collective commitment or an understanding of this thing. That's where the soft problems are very interesting. You cannot solve a soft problem like a hard problem. You can only resolve it, which means you can only take it to a good enough position. Of course, you know the term satisficing. You can satisfy and then suffice it. So it's one of those reconciliations.
Maybe for the benefit of our listeners, why don't you explain this term satisficing? What is the origin of this term and what are the contexts in which it applies and describes some of the things that we see.
So again, let's just stick with the traffic example here. I sometimes, when I drive from DC to New York, I take the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. It's a glorious bridge. But of course, if I go 40 minutes north, depending on the traffic, I go to the George Washington Bridge. The toll is like just one way. I think it's $12, $15 or something. While coming out, it's free. Verrazano Narrows Bridge, it's currently $25 each way. And so it is the kind of the value attached to the time value of that I try to put in. Okay, let me just take to get to Queens or wherever. But there are people who won't be able to afford that. If you are driving a tractor trailer or something, you can be paying hundreds of dollars on this, depending on the load and whatnot permits. And it comes down to, even though you could have forced everyone to pay $25 to take that on and go forth. That would have been a solution in a finite context. I don't know, maybe it's possible in Singapore, but it's definitely not possible in New Jersey, New York area. But these psychological variables, okay, I'm not in such a rush. Let me just take the GW Bridge or Lincoln Tunnel or whatever. So it kind of alters my option space here. And because you have multiple option sets here, right there you get this diffuse nature of you don't have a perfect solution for this thing. And that's also the idea of waiting for Uber, right? The biggest psychological development there, and a good friend of mine reminds me of this often, is not the fact that you can press a ride and someone comes to you, but it is a small icon that shows where the person actually is, the taxi, the icon, so that you can, if it's a 10-minute wait, you can go to the kitchen, make yourself a tea, and come back rather than just sit there or stand in anxiety where it is. Right? So these are small of those things. It didn't really solve anything. It actually satisfies a situation where you got some temporary relief from it. And the person also knows, okay, I have a business waiting at the end of this ride or after this ride. So, so that's a example. Let's get to the messy problems, which emerge with the interaction of the hard and the soft. And they are often defined by the value systems, the cultural elements here. And the air pollution problem, or the seasonal air pollution problem, perhaps has a value, a dimension to it, because people are sometimes left helpless. What am I supposed to do if no one else is supporting me through this annual ritual? Then what am I supposed to do? You can see these kinds of embedded practices in a wide range of contexts. In my previous book, I wrote about what was, I think, my most powerful experience. I spent some time in Banaras, Varanasi. I spent a lot of time with the Mahant, the chief of the Sankat Mochan Hanuman Temple, Veerbhadra Mishra, who had a PhD in environmental engineering, was a professor at IIT, but also in the great lineage of Tulsidas. So I sat at the very stone bench, rather, where Tulsidas wrote and composed Ramcharitmanas. Potentially under the tree that probably multi-generational. And so he and I talked extensively, and I went on my own so this was in Hanuman Ghat where he was based, but then extensively walked around the city. I went to Manikarnika Ghat, and of course, that's the most popular thing everyone sees, right? All the thing. But of course, you look around just slightly away from what's most popular, what's most sensational, and you see the direct effluents of sewage straight into rivers. This is some years ago, and since then our awareness has improved, and of course there are political interests in cleaning the river, and since then we have done a great job with it. But it goes back to this idea, okay, let me just put the ultra reliable filtration membranes everywhere, and that's one way to solve it. But there's no way you can make any progress in going and telling the people, saying that you cannot do cremation practices here or do this. It is an utterly powerful vision of coexistence. There are dogs, there are donkeys, there are people, alive and dead, and there's a dynamic system that's going on. At that point, when you go and stand at the Manikarnika Ghat on the cremation grounds, and you look at the river doesn't look like a river. It has a very different. It is a deeply cultural, socio-economic system of faith, of commerce in this case. And even if you look at the class system of the wood that they use for the rituals and so forth. You got mango, you got teak, and you got sandalwood, which is the business class of the cremations and so forth. And it's utterly interesting. All we have to do is just go look at it. I said, here is an engineer and a priest trying to understand this system. And he does research. I mean, he did now, rest in peace, but he did research at IIT. And then he comes and tells stories melded with the spiritual value. You cannot say that the classic error that technocrats do is go into a context potentially foreign to them and say, don't do this, backfires. Time and again, we have seen this everywhere.
So a lot of time, I think what you're trying to say is the context can be very, very complex and messy. If you ignore the context and just do from blank slate, anyone who's thinking logically can come up with a solution. For example, going back to Delhi pollution thing, people can ask a naive question, why can't we stop these farmers from burning these crops? But there are a lot of economic, social reasons behind all of that, and there are millions of farmers involved. And without understanding their full context and history, you can't even begin to take a shot at trying to solve the problem.
You're exactly correct. That is why if you carefully and methodically think through any classic engineering question, the political dimensions become immediately apparent. But unfortunate thing is sometimes engineers, maybe even oftentimes engineers, don't want to deal with this thing. Well, let me just focus on this. Let me bracket out all of these concerns and then deal with this thing. So I think that's where we need to be very cognizant. If we go back to the point that I made earlier as an original cultural choice, then engineering is politics by other means. It is an instrument through which we achieve these goals. And that's precisely why, I mean, if you even look at the deliberate distinction between, let's say we know through antiquities and beyond, the role of engineering in conflict. We all started building weapons, even the earliest the stone technologies that we use. So there's this deeply embedded tie with the protection, military and so forth. That's why we even created the field called civil engineering, which is to distinguish the otherwise, direct association with conflict and so forth. So I think at that junction, we have some fascinating issues coming out. So when a hard problem interacts with a soft problem, interacting with a messy problem, you get a wicked problem with those 10 characteristics. The interesting thing is there's a hard problem nested in a soft problem, and which is nested in a messy problem. And so therefore, you cannot just solve a problem, a wicked problem, because you're only dealing with an aspect of it. So you can only solve a hard problem, and as we discussed earlier, you can resolve a soft problem. And by extension, you can only dissolve a messy problem.
So Guru, let me go to one of the messy problems that you treated really well in the book, which is making modern aviation safe. Today we take it for granted that, just take a flight, go anywhere you want to go. But 100 years ago, it was quite a messy problem. The fatality rate was really high, very high degree of unpredictability. It wasn't even clear how to train pilots. There was not enough planes available and so on. During both World War I and World War II, a lot of pilots were losing their lives, not because enemy did something to them, is their plane doing something to them, because there was just, safety standards were so lax. But somehow, you talk about the story of Ed Link and many other people. So, in what ways, first of all, what attracted you to this problem to begin with? Why this problem as a substrate for the book, as you called it? And then progression of the story, what happened during these years where today airplanes are perhaps the safest way to commute anywhere?
Yeah, and just for your listeners' background, aviation is not my area at all. And so I trained as a control systems engineer. And then all of my graduate studies were all in complex systems engineering, so notably biomedical engineering, built medical products, and so forth. And but I studied at the State University of New York in Binghamton. Binghamton is a small city in upstate New York where IBM was founded, has a very rich tradition of systems science and so forth. Some foundational breakthroughs have occurred there. And it is a community that is intertwined with the university and in a fashion that's not visible in other cities like Boston, New York, or London, and so forth. So the community played as much a role in shaping my sensibility as an engineer as my professional training here. And during my entire course of education there, about 5 years, I heard Ed Link's name maybe twice or thrice in passing. I didn't know about it. I didn't care about it.
Yes.
It was 10 years after I left Binghamton, working in DC. I was actually waiting for a friend of mine at the local science museum. And a friend was running late, and I stood in front of this box, which is just like a cardboard box, blue in color. And I was just walking around looking at what was happening. And at that point, I had started Wicked Problems book, but I didn't have this narrative thread at all. And I'm looking at this box, and everywhere around the world, everywhere in the world, we're told to think outside the box. I'm keep looking at this, so I'm like, maybe I need to think inside the box. Is how it started, and the story automatically caught me, and I deliberately introduced a second track, which could stand on its own.
Which box was this?
That is the Ed Link's Blue Box, as it's called, which was the original flight trainer, which laid the basis for what we now call flight simulators. The difference between trainers and simulators is basically computerization and advanced technologies that have guided. Ed Link is a fascinating character. He didn't even pass high school. Some say even middle school he dropped out. Self-trained engineer, comes from a musical tradition. His family was in the piano making business. And so he ended up playing with those, installing organ systems, and the whole idea of player pianos, which are the advanced technology. You drop in a nickel and it starts playing. It basically replaced an orchestra, which kind of foreshadows the discussion that we're happening now. Oh my God, is AI going to take my job or not? These are continual kind of themes that we are faced. But the real revolution in an engineering sense that happened was how he moved from player pianos to flight trainers. Because Ed Link was interested in flight. Flights were so expensive. They were also risky. Deaths were common. And in a hard engineering way, it was a solvable problem. If we had many planes, we could train many people. But that was just not the case. Planes were very expensive. So that's why since the first tests of the Wright brothers, even they struggled how to train others. So they had this huge location in Ohio, and they brought in students, and they created all sorts of these artificial conditions so that people could get the feel for it. But ultimately, it's a fascinating set of developments filled with accidents, deaths, tragedies.
And this was all the way till 20s, 30s, even 40s?
Yeah, 1912, 1915, after the early flight demonstrations. This was in the late 1920s. He wrote up a patent application, literally exactly 100 years ago we are talking about. And look what we are now looking at. And of course, we still are victims of accidents, including what's in news right now. And so that points to this broader question of how do you deal with these utterly complex systems? And I think Ed Link had the firmest grasp of this. He didn't believe in hyper-specialization, and he intuitively understood the system's value of it, because it was not just, you're not just training a pilot or a student to become a pilot on the technology of flight.
So let's break it down. So most people would not have seen a flight simulator. So till late 20s, early 30s, the only way to learn how to fly a plane is to get into a plane, even if you've never flown before, hopefully with an instructor, and you're mucking with real plane and doing things and figuring it out, and obviously you will make mistakes.
Even not that, because when Ed Link tried to learn, he learned how to fly. He signed up for a couple of classes with the Charlie Chaplin's brother, Sidney Chaplin, in LA. So he started a flight career after acting, I think, and it would be a two-seater plane. So the student would be sitting in the back, and the instructor would be showing, okay, these are the controls. Look and watch how I do. And they would take them through a couple of spins and everything, and then the people would come back dizzy and everything. And then what a way to learn how to fly. And these should be like hundreds of dollars back then, very expensive for an hour or a class. So he wanted to come up with a very cost-effective approach that could reach the masses. So he came up with a training manual, and he had his own hangar, and he used to repair airplanes during the day, and in the evenings he would teach classes and so forth. And the basic idea was to use the suction mechanisms in the player pianos, because he was just sitting on it one day on the factory floor, and he got the feel for it. Okay, this feels almost like flying. Let me see what I can do with it. So he constructs he mimics an airplane structure, puts wings, ailerons, fuselage, and so forth, makes it look like the box. This is the box that really captured my attention. So you have to go inside it. It's interesting. Tall people, it's very difficult to get in. I mean, I found it very hard to fit in myself. I'm slightly bigger, but it's a very small box. But the basic idea is you are confined in a dark space. There's a hood on it. So you're sitting in a dark space. You have no outside reference to horizon. Learning how to fly a plane becomes a critical problem when you're dealing with darkness and bad weather, especially. How do you know what direction you're going in? And how do you get the influence? And that was the whole idea of the seat of the plants flying and everything. Because someone is thinking that they're going straight and level, but they're actually spinning down to the floor. So you basically lack those issues. And I learned how to fly a plane on a simulator and so forth. And I talk about that. And then the book, I had an instructor who's featured in the book. And I'm trying to, so this was in Florida. And I go on a spin with her, or completely electronically. And I'm trying to land the plane in a strip that I see. It turns out to be NASA. I'm not supposed to be landing there. So how do you deal with these things? And I feel like I'm over there, I'm flying at 10,000 feet, but then something is off and something goes,
all this in the simulator, not real plane.
Exactly. It is the ability to deal with all these distractions that are in front of you. Not just rely on those instruments, but to trust them. How do you get? So it is a perfect marriage of human psychology and the technology that has now afforded us this convenience.
So going back to Ed Link's this blue box. So this was, as you say, basically a cardboard box with some controls, etc. And it was able to mimic flying to some extent. What was the journey of starting from there to all the way up to modern simulators, where I guess you can almost not tell the difference whether you're in a real plane or not? They're like very sophisticated and advanced. What role do you think simulators have played, first of all, in making aviation safe? And how did this journey unfold over, I don't know how many decades?
Yeah, so here are the top level highlights here, because the stories are really fascinating and it needed to be told. So that's why I spent, this book was otherwise a 2-year project, became a 6.5-year project. And I think I had to teach myself aviation. I went to aeronautics.
You learned flying because of you writing this book, and you wanted to do
through simulations. And granted, before I did this book and everything, and I'm still alive, I used to do skydiving a few times.
Well, that's the message to aspiring authors. And if you really want to get into subject, like really get into it, go to Florida and learn how to fly, and then you'll be able to write about it, from very different context and feel versus just reading about it. Yeah.
So he comes up with this box, and he has no market. the classic entrepreneur story. No one wants to buy it, much like the Sony Walkman case. No one wanted to buy it. And then finally some stenographers in the Japanese court
Sounds
system
very
were
familiar with my own entrepreneur story. Start building something, hopefully somebody will buy it.
Exactly. So happens to Ed Link. And so it's another continuing theme of humanity. And he's basically doing all these demos in county fairs. People are paying a quarter here for a spin here and there, and he gets leftover hot dogs and everything from these shows, and that's how they basically sustain their life. And finally, there's some auto exhibit or something, some kind of a trade show, and he and his brother drag this hitched to a Ford car. They go there and they actually laugh him out of the exhibit, saying that this is a carnival ride. Why are you even insulting us? And so he reaches a point where he's ready to sell his company to anyone who would pay him $500 total. And then comes a tragedy, which suddenly puts Ed Link into business, because it was a time and it was a political scandal. One administration wanted to boost efficiency. They consolidated, this was under Herbert Hoover, and consolidated all these airline companies, and then leading into the next administration comes a postal crisis, believe it or not. And they had too many crashes because of bad weather and so forth. And finally, you end up having the U.S. Army delivering postal mail in Curtiss bombers and so forth. It's kind of...
They're not throwing mail from the top, I hope.
Exactly. And then even then, these issues happen. And so one after another, calamities after calamities, then they realize, yeah, we need a formalized training mechanism. And then Ed Link, so Ed Link's friend and promoter, basically, sets up this demo in Newark Airport. And Ed Link, and the book starts with that how he takes off in the Binghamton Airport and gets to Newark, and how he lands in complete darkness. And that's all the demo that these Army officials needed to have trust. They didn't even have to try out the actual simulator, or the trainer rather. He saw, how could you do that? And that's when it happens. And but the real value happened during World War II rather. And the Brits ended up coming in an exchange program, and they end up learning. And it's also a fascinating story where they not only have to learn how to fly, but they also have to learn American English. And so it's utterly fascinating history. And I had a lot of fun delving into even the history of player pianos and everything, and what a technological marvel that was. It is not an easy technology at all. If you look at it, it is just an altogether, I don't think we even have that skill set to understand that. And this man, in late life, was actually reconstructing an organ from his earlier years. So he was sourcing tubes from all sorts of places, and these pipes and everything. So he was an utterly mechanical mind. And then, of course, the war gives him enormous business. And he comes up with all sorts of related inventions like celestial navigation. How do you understand the dark sky and the patterns and the directionality? So, and how do you train as a group rather than a one at a time person? How do you coordinate bombing patterns and flight? So one after another, he improves it. And then for his side interests, because the job is so stressful, he picks up fishing, and so he goes to these remote places in Canada, and he decides to invent a portable canoe that could be folded in a suitcase and go. So he's like very inventive on those things. But then and then he gets into some race, and he finds a way to ingeniously win it by going in the exact opposite direction than the experts are suggesting. And it was at a time when computers started coming in, and the space mission demanded a very different type of, the moon mission rather, demanded a different type of rigors. And of course, computerization had to come in. And Ed Link, for some reason, said that, well, that's going slightly beyond the kind of the training philosophy that I had, because with the computer, you're just sitting and watching something rather than engaging with it. So he quits the business at the peak of his career and goes to underwater oceanography, basically borrowing the principles of a player piano that he had adapted for aviation, but for underwater system. So here's a man who has literally bridged space and seas, deep seas.
Incredible.
And most people can call it a great career if they have one product that succeeds for 10 years or something like that. But here, different domains.
Yeah.
And at the end of his career and life, he was also dabbling into energy. How do you come up with renewable energy and so forth, which was a big deal in the 1960s and so forth. So, and of course, he encounters personal tragedy. He loses his son in one of the deep water explorations. And in that grief, he comes up with advanced safety technologies to make exploration possible. Who gets to use that years later? James Cameron for Titanic and several others. And his James Cameron's medical advisor, Joe McInnes, who I interviewed for this book, was a close collaborator with Ed Link.
Yeah, the Titanic movie starts with that scene of him and James
That's
Cameron
all
over
possible
the
because
bottom.
of Ed Link's work. So here is one of the most profound portfolio of engineering work that no one knows, or have we just conveniently forgotten? This is a question to ask. So that's why Ed Link's life, with the sheer fearlessness to engage with these kinds of utterly complex problems in literally very different medium, provides me the motivation to say, you know what, maybe we need a different kind of sensibility like Ed Link to engage with the wicked systems that we're dealing with.
Yeah, today, we take airline safety for granted. Most of us don't know who Edwin Link was. But as you say, there is this guy who was just obsessed about engineering, about pushing the envelope, trying different things, and fearless. In the end, he ended up losing his son in effectively an experiment, trying a new product underwater and so on. But utterly committed to his vision, and as a result, incredible impact over almost a career lasting nearly half a century, and in many different domains. Again and again, going back to basics, getting his hands dirty.
You got the fundamentals right, and I think that's the basic idea here. I think we need to regroup our fundamentals to engage with these wicked systems. But then there's the sad politics of recognition here. You go to the National Air and Space Museum in DC. It's one of my favorite museums. You go to the main hall and everything. You got a rock from the moon. You got these big things floating around. Where's the blue box that made this all possible? And I've had these conversations with my friends at the Smithsonian and so forth, and I think they have it in the storage. But it'll be nice if they put it in the main floor
Well,
to
at
show
least
that this is what's happening here.
You told his story very beautifully. It's an enjoyable read, and I think listeners.
But I think so. That's where the wicked systems connections comes in. Let's look at the physics of flight. A plane exists in 6 different degrees of freedom, as they call, position relative to the horizon.
Yeah.
You got the rotational axis and you got the translational axis, pitch, roll, and yaw.
Yeah.
In fact, when I started this book, I didn't quite know the difference between roll and yaw.
Yeah.
So I had to teach everything myself there. And then you got...
And maybe let's clarify everyone and for myself also. So I'm guessing if this is a plane, so pitch is obviously up and down, roll is this movement, and yaw is going this way.
Correct.
So 6 degrees of freedom. Yeah.
That's 3. And then in the vertical one, so you got then you add the X domain and everything. So up and down here. And so you put them together, those are the possible operating circumstances of a plane. And you need to have controls for that. What would it mean to have a 6 degrees of freedom for wicked problems is what I had. So systems engineers.
You have those 6 in the book. I'm going to go to the index, but you can. So what are those 6 degrees of freedom for, if you remember from the book?
Yeah, so I call them, I parcel them as the synergistic 6, as they call it. Yeah. So if you look at modern flight simulators, they call the synergistic 6 because they have these utterly integrated movement systems and fidelity systems and so forth. So the synergistic 6, when it comes to wicked problems, are how do you subject a problem through these different filters, shall we say. You got efficiency. You start with efficiency, don't end with it. And I'm trained as a control systems engineer, so efficiency was my destination. Anything that I had to do had to achieve that answer or address that problem. But here for wicked systems, you have to start with efficiency, not end with it. Then you have the vagueness of the problem quality itself, and has deep philosophical basis to do that. And also, and I get into the links between engineering and philosophical thinking. And how one informs the other. So you're looking at the different, when does a grain of sand stop becoming a grain of sand, and when does it become? So those are some deeper issues. For example,
And maybe to interrupt there, when you're dealing with vagueness in the messy problem context, is it about accepting that certain amount of vagueness will never go away, or you're trying to transform something from vague to reasonably well-defined, contained problem?
even also to understand what the variables are, even if we don't know what their values are. So, and I think that's right. We sometimes operate with the feeling that, yep, I exactly understand the problem, and we go with it, completely removing the vagueness. And I think engineers are well trained in uncertainty analysis, especially in quality management and so forth. And I think we have done a good job here. But I think, how do you deal with otherwise complex conditions where you have to deal with vague situations? I think Bertrand Russell had this fantastic example. I mean, he described a paradox, and I'm just paraphrasing it. You have a car, and you have 100 cars. It's a parking lot. You have 1,000 cars. It's a traffic. You got 1,000,000 cars. It's a mega city. You got 1,000,000,000 cars. You got climate change. At each level, you have a set of properties with the same system that you're dealing with, but in a greater collection. With so you have to be proficient at these levels of abstraction, which kind of has this connection with Ed Link's story as well. I mean, a plane on a runway is different versus something else. So that's vagueness. Then you got vulnerability, which I think I take way beyond risk management, standard risk management, which engineers are good at. But how do you think of the conditions in which something becomes susceptible to something else? So that's important. And of course, there are so many disasters, failure modes that we have to worry about. Then brute force safety, and ultimately that's the human psychology of it. We all want it. So what are the different elements of it? But at the same time, it's not. We shouldn't always stop at the level of how safe is safe enough, which itself is a vague question. Degrees of vagueness. You define it differently than I do. But also how fair is safe enough, and I think that's an important question to think about. Maintenance, the unsung, underappreciated aspect of society that actually enables newness, novelty, and innovation in society. And too often, almost always, we just attach our recognition to the novel outcomes rather than the mundane, boring drudgery that leads to those things. So I wanted to highlight the role of maintenance in this thing. And of course, aviation is a classic example of how maintenance is a prerequisite for safety. Without it, and it's well orchestrated, well structured, and even in my professional experience as a medical device person, you just cannot fool around. So maintenance becomes an integrated practice.
Would you know, for every hour of flying that a commercial airplane goes through, what are the corresponding number of hours of maintenance it has to undergo?
I think the modern maintenance practices have changed because now maintenance has become a service, basically, because that's also outsourced by a company, the airline companies. But I think there are statistics, which I'm not able to remember correctly, but as technology went, for example, when we had twin-engine aircrafts, maintenance demands were different. And then we went to bigger aircrafts. We got 4-engine aircraft, which maintenance took much longer and so forth. And now we are back to these twin engines, but with these advanced avionics and electronic systems and data collection possibilities that we have and whatnot. These are, but I think altogether, importantly, we are not doing reactive maintenance, like, okay, for every hour we have to do this. But the predictive maintenance approaches that we have gotten, thanks to these continuous monitoring technologies, are fantastic. So which means they're almost in sync with the operational time and beyond. So maintenance is this hidden aspect. Even these big companies, right? I mean, most notably from Silicon Valley, that talk about disruptive innovation and so forth, invest 60-70% in maintenance work. They can't afford their servers to go down for all the things that you're talking about. So that's also a politics of recognition that surfaces. And finally, resilience. This is something as profound as it is. It emerges from a very narrow context that involves an engineer, a British engineer, who was assessing the quality of wood, basically a carpentry shop. That's where resilience originates. Looking at what kinds of wood and what qualities of wood are best usable for building ships. And simple stress over strain ratio leads to this idea. And that's the kind of the modern mathematical manifestation of resilience. But of course, if you look at even ancient Hindu scriptures and everything, I mean, if you even go back to Bhagavad Gita and so forth, Krishna's advising kind of a desperate Arjuna in the battlefield, saying that, and Krishna is like talking about achieving self-consciousness, self-balance, self-realization through the concept of sthita prajna, which is like this is one of those uninfluenced state. Much like how even Zen philosophy has this thing, a grass bends but a big tree falls. And so there are deep spiritual elements of this that are apparent in engineering systems if we care to look for them. So I try to look at this. What does it mean to have an ecological basis for engineering, and what resilience means, and even let's say in a commercial ecosystem, what does it mean? It is a complex topic here. It also pertains to individual levels. So each and every concept of operations, the 6 degrees of freedom rather, have this extension from deeply personal to, let's say, a societal value.
And thinking about these ideas like maintenance, resilience may not be very sexy. You know, when you think of wicked problem, you think of this breakthrough innovation, this massive patents and IP. But what you are saying is, you know, there is these backstream components of solving a problem and ensuring it stays solved. Just making an airplane is not enough. You need to operate for the next 40 years, and it needs to, every single flight has to be safe, which requires investment in these areas. And I think earlier you were mentioning before we started that going back to the idea of Indian scriptures, that in Indian society, the idea of maintenance has been very deeply ingrained in the social and political institutions of the past. I don't know what about today. And you were giving examples of Indus Valley civilization.
Yeah, not too far from here in Rajasthan, right? I mean, it's astonishing. Our forefathers, 6,000 years ago, and this is something that I get really inspired, energized about to think about. Advanced engineering, civilization enabling work. What do they choose to focus on first? Sanitation. And every house in Mohenjo-daro had a had a washroom and a water-based latrine. Seems stunning that millennia later in modern India we don't have that facility. So makes you wonder what were these original defining principles that led these people. I mean, relatively speaking, it was a short-lived civilization, and then they quickly dissipated. But of course, some of the artifacts that we still have, thankfully, they've been dug out with a lot of work, are interesting because if you look at Mohenjo-daro's sanitation system, and of course their grid-based city system. Look at modern New York City, and just subtract the skyscrapers, and you got the basic Indus layout. Cloaca Maxima, which is the oldest running sewer system right now, which is in Italy. So you go to Rome, and in my recent trip to Rome, of course, you see the lines outside the Vatican, of course, going for miles. And I choose to go to the Cloaca Maxima, where there are a couple of homeless people with their tents on and everything. And I think I startled them because I took photos of it, and there's no one there. And then I was like, this is the life-giving resource, far more divine than anything else. And that's 2,200 years old.
2,200 year old sewer system
still running. Yeah, still running. And of course, New York City sewer system was inspired by that. And then intercut London, and you had Joseph Bazalgette, who had the intercepting sewer system, all borrowed, all flowing from this. But of course, we are talking about, centuries, millennia of development here.
Yeah.
Compare that to what's happening in aviation. In less than 100 years, we have gotten that. And so there are different time scales, going back to this vagueness concept, how you have to adjust your time level. How do you think in logarithms? We have all done that, but we don't know how to think effectively in logarithms. And I think there's something about that understanding scale and complexity that's important for dealing with complex adaptive systems.
And in the book, as you were going through all these 6 different filters, often you narrate a story of a disaster. Typically, something bad happens, and then it spurs people into action, and then you reach out to, you think very deeply about the systems, foundations, and so on. But it seems like that's a big impetus for people to take action. Things don't happen unless there is a big disaster. I think at some point you talk about this molasses disaster, which was, quite a...
Yeah, there are a couple of types of disasters that I deal with. Of course, some of them are utterly serious, and they forced global attention on this. The molasses disaster was such a peculiar one, and it was like, it has all sorts of connections to even why we started getting molasses from the Caribbean to this, and the role of slavery in transporting those things, and the essential labor. But then, of course, the classic engineering aspect of it is they build this gargantuan tank to store this molasses, and they get shipment, and it's 2 million gallons or something like that. And then right after a shipment, sometime again, almost 100 years ago, the system starts cracking because someone thought the structure was ready to stand without adequate safety margins. So it was, of course, built for a much lower safety factor than what was required. And one day Boston becomes unseasonably warm in January or February that year. And then people are relaxing on the streets, and then boom, the thing explodes. And basically it opens up this flood going at 35 miles per hour, engulfing everyone. And school kids coming that afternoon are all like, wrapped like candies, fudge candies. And the trains are falling off of the trestles, and utterly dramatic
like
experience.
What you see in some of the movies, this 2 million gallon tank of molasses. Molasses, one can visualize like very thick honey or something like that.
Yeah, even thicker than that. Yeah,
thicker than that, and just flowing in all directions all over the city.
That's it. The structure fails and takes over 20 people died. But then, of course, a lot more effort goes into construction of these containers and so forth. There's also a related example in the maintenance chapter where I talk about steamships back then in the 1800s that helped to bolster the American economy, and they also helped transport molasses as well. So, but then the captains wanted to have thrill. They stoked their boilers and they sped their ships and so forth, and they didn't really care much about the boiler. So they were ill-maintained, defective boilers and so forth, and that led to regulations on for pressure vessels, and that now defines modern industry standards. Even how we go about manufacturing safety critical products. So a lot of again, politics happens there too. The kind of the soft and the messy aspects of it, because people started saying that, well, the government is meddling too much into the private business aspect of it and everything. So some of the themes that we are now talking about in headlines were happening there.
And part of is your book targeted towards policymakers, decision makers to embrace the complexity involved in systems design, which is required for solving wicked problems? Because typically you will hear the political rhetoric, which is, we'll go to moon in this decade, or budgets, or innovation IP, or this rock star scientist, but not so much conversation about the just complexity and messiness of building, everything that's required and put it together. So is part of, what you're trying to do is educate people for deeper appreciation, perhaps investment, and embracing of the engineering process in the overall objective setting, and trying to, make the world a better place.
And to rehearse, be serious about our diligence at this. Arthur Schlesinger, the famous writer, once said that we have much more pluribus than unum. And
we should explain that, it's American.
Yeah, so that's the standard. That's those words define American democracy, e pluribus unum, out of many one. And Schlesinger, I think, was pointing to the plurality of the situation where we have far more emphasis. I mean, that's the reality as well. The diversity in terms of viewpoints and solution sets and businesses and everything. I'm more into standards. So engineering sometimes emphasizes standards at the expense of diversity. And civic life oftentimes focuses on diversity at the expense of standards. And I think we need both. And so that's why I've tried to present engineering as an instrument for civic engagement. And vice versa, because I think both are important and both influence each other. And I tend to believe that engineering is far more influential even than the concept or the construct of democracy, because it affects everyone. And so it's one of those self-thinking processes. I had to write it for myself.
Yeah.
Of course, the book could have been written any different ways. It could have even been done without Ed Link. But then it had to be its way. I let it emerge.
Yeah. In the past, engineering meant tinkering with things, building things with your own hands, being able to see all these moving parts and so on. But now we are in the era of automation, which with AI is going to a different zone altogether. Tomorrow's system may be designed by AI. We may not even understand what the underlying principles and vulnerabilities are. How do you think engineering needs to evolve with what's looming? It is no question that AI is going to be an integral part of whatever we do, including designing complex systems.
It's fascinating, and I think that that's a question for us personally and professionally. I mean, of course, every conference or every meeting that I go to, AI shows up, and increasingly that makes me thinking.
Every podcast also now.
Maybe we need another AI. In my view, it's the ancient intelligence, and I think why are we not focusing on what's utterly important that's right in front of us, and how do we get to the foundations and the fundamentals of the work here? This might sound all old-fashioned here, but I think without these fundamentals, we are running a serious risk of coming up with systems that we don't fully understand, and they have enormous influence on us. And again, I'm not one of those people who's too paranoid about these new technologies and so forth. I welcome them, but not at the expense of losing our fundamentals. And as long as we are clear that as engineers and as an engineering profession, the responsibility that is given to us, afforded to us, is far more serious. We are held accountable for our work. A lot of professions in society can get away with a lot of. I think we engineers don't have this. Engineering is peer reviewed by reality.
Yeah.
And I think there is this ancient Greek saying that this Libyan giant who I think loses contact with reality and his life changes altogether differently. And so it's almost that way. The moment engineers lose contact with reality, it's different. Of course, we are in this arena of simulation. We are creating these virtual worlds and twins and so forth. And that's the abstraction that we have to transcend. Time travel, world travel, future travel. Yeah.
I think, Guru, you're doing outstanding work talking about topics as they're relevant to engineers and engineering and how it pertains to society. I just want to thank you for writing both of your previous books, How Engineers Think, and this one, Wicked Problem. I hear you have one more in the works, but it is a very important topic and often not discussed in the public discourse. We live in the world that is created by engineers. All the modern amenities, whether these lights here or cameras or anything we do, it's just we are very deeply touched by engineers. So the culture of engineering, philosophy behind engineering, the practices or lack thereof, all of that affects all of us deeply. And I think you do an outstanding job on bringing it out to life with so many fascinating stories in the book. So I want to thank you for both writing the book as well as taking the time to speak to me on this episode. I'm sure a lot of people will find the conversation very inspiring. Thank you so much, Guru.
I'm very glad we could visit, and thank you, and thanks to your viewers.
At SparX, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to SparX on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.